I'm 73 years old. For the last 20 years, I lived with a secret that I carried alone every single day until 3 months ago when she vanished. Her name, at least the name I gave her, was Corey. I found her in a tidal grotto half a mile from my house in the autumn of 1998, tangled in ghost fishing gear, barely alive. She had the torso of a woman and the lower body of something built for deep water. I know how that sounds. I won't ask you to believe it, but I need to tell this now because the grotto is empty, and I don't know if she left by choice, if something took her, or if I failed her in some way I still can't see. For 2 decades, I kept her alive. I learned her patterns. I watched her heal, then stay, then become part of the rhythm of my life in a way I can't adequately explain to someone who wasn't there. And then, on a morning that felt like every other morning, I climbed down to the cave and found nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, just salt water. And stone, and the absence of her. This is what happened, this is what I saw, and this is why I can't let it go. My name is Silas Huff, and I've spent 56 years on this stretch of coast. I was born in the house my grandfather built in 1947, a salt box cottage wedged into the granite shelf above Sparrow Rock, where the North Atlantic chews through stone and driftwood with the same indifference. I worked commercial fishing from the time I was 16 until my back gave out at 51. Lobster boats mostly, offshore trawlers for a few years when the money got tight. I know the water here the way some men know their own land. The shoals that shift with each winter storm, the channels that run deep enough for a keel, the places where the current turns unpredictable and vicious without warning. When I retired, I stayed. There was never a question of leaving. My wife, Mary Ann, had passed 4 years earlier, and our daughter had long since moved to Portland with her own family. The house was paid off. I had my pension, a garden that produced more than I needed, and the kind of solitude that most people say they want but can't actually survive. I survived it fine. The coast here is not gentle. It's a 40-minute drive to the nearest town, longer in winter when the road ices over. My closest neighbor is 2 miles south, a couple who summer here and leave by October. For 8 months of the year, I see no one unless I drive out, which I rarely do. Groceries every 2 weeks, mail once a week if the weather holds. The rest is just me, the house, and the ocean. I'm telling you this because it matters. I'm not a man given to fantasy or exaggeration. I don't drink more than a beer with dinner. I've never had a history of mental illness, hallucinations, or anything else you might use to explain away what I'm about to describe. I'm a fisherman. I observe things. I remember details. It's how you survive out there. You notice when the wind shifts, when the birds start moving wrong, when the water changes color in a way that means trouble. That skill didn't leave me when I retired. The grotto sits at the base of a granite outcrop about half a mile north of my house, accessible only during the lowest tides of the month. It's a sea cave, maybe 30 feet deep and 20 wide at the mouth, carved out over millennia by wave action and tidal surge. At high tide, it fills completely, 12 feet of water, sometimes more during storms. At low tide, a narrow shingle beach appears, and you can walk inside if you don't mind cold water up to your knees and the certainty that you've got maybe 2 hours before the tide turns and traps you. I'd been inside it 100 times over the years. I used to take my daughter there when she was young, looking for starfish and crabs in the tidal pools. After Mary Ann died, I'd go there sometimes just to sit. The acoustics inside are strange. The waves echo in a way that feels almost like conversation. Aisau's low murmur that rises and falls. It was a good place to think. I knew that cave. I knew its moods, the smell of it, the way the light came through the entrance and turned the water green in summer, gray in winter. I knew it was empty except for barnacles, kelp, and the occasional seal that hauled out on the rocks outside. That knowledge made what I found there in October of 1998 impossible to reconcile. It was early morning, just after dawn. The tide charts had shown a king tide, one of the lowest of the year, and I'd planned to check the grotto for storm damage. We'd had 3 days of heavy weather, the kind that rearranges the coastline and deposits debris in places you'd never expect. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and made the walk north along the rocks. The air was still. The kind of still that follows a storm when the wind has finally exhausted itself, and everything feels scraped clean. Gulls were calling from the cliffs, and the water was that deep, glassy gray that means the ocean is gathering itself for the next push. I rounded the outcrop and saw the grotto mouth open and dark. The beach was exposed, just as I'd expected, a narrow strip of black stones still wet from the last wave cycle. I stepped carefully. The rocks were slick with kelp, and a fall out here alone could mean waiting hours for the tide to bring help or drown you, whichever came first. I made it to the entrance and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating stone walls slick with seawater and the usual scatter of shells and driftwood. I swept the light across the back of the cave, checking the ceiling for cracks, and that's when I saw the net. Ghost gear. Tangled in a mass against the far wall, the blue and orange synthetic webbing that commercial fisheries use, illegal to abandon, but abandoned all the time. Currents carry it for miles. It wraps around rocks, around whales, around anything that moves through it, and it had wrapped around something. I stepped further inside, water sloshing around my calves, the cold biting through the rubber of my boots. The flashlight beam steadied on the shape, and my breath caught. There was a body in the net, pale skin, long dark hair plastered across a bare back, arms twisted in the webbing. My first thought, my only thought for several seconds, was that someone had drowned, that a swimmer or a kayaker had been caught in the storm, and the ocean had deposited her here like it deposits everything else it's done with. I moved closer, already running through what I'd need to do. Call the Coast Guard. Don't touch the body. Preserve the scene. Then she moved. It wasn't much. A twitch of the shoulders, a shuddering breath that I heard even over the sound of the water. She was alive. I lunged forward, dropping to my knees in the shallows, hands reaching for the netting. It was pulled tight across her torso, cutting into her skin, and I fumbled for the knife I kept. On my belt, a folding blade I used for cutting line. My hands were shaking. I sliced through the first strand, then the second. The net was layered, twisted, and she was tangled deep. I kept cutting, pulling the webbing away, talking without realizing it. Hold on, I've got you, just hold on. And then I reached the part of her that wasn't human. The lower body wasn't legs. I stopped. My hands were still holding the knife, still gripping a section of net, but I couldn't move. The flashlight had fallen onto the stones, its beam angled up and across her, and I saw it clearly. From the waist down, she wasn't human. The structure was streamlined, muscular, covered in something that looked like skin, but moved like scales when the light hit it. There was a tail, not decorative, not costume. A tail built for propulsion, for deep water, lying limp and twisted in the netting like a dolphin's fluke, but longer, more powerful. I don't know how long I knelt there. It could have been good seconds. It could have been minutes. She made a sound, a wet, rasping breath, and I came back to myself. I started cutting again. I didn't think. I didn't process. I just cut until the last of the net fell away, and she was free, lying in the shallow water, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored gasps. I sat back on my heels, the knife still in my hand, and stared at her. Her face was human, completely human. She had a nose, lips, closed eyes beneath dark lashes crusted with salt. Her hair was long, tangled with kelp and sand. Her hands had fingers, nails, the delicate bones of a wrist. But the rest of her was not. And she was dying. I need to be precise about what I saw because precision is the only thing I have left now that she's gone. Her skin from the waist up was pale, not the pallor of someone who'd drowned, but a living paleness, the kind you see on people who don't spend time in the sun. There were no gills on her neck. I checked. I don't know what I expected, but there was nothing there except smooth skin, a collarbone, the normal structure of a human throat. Her breathing was wrong, though, shallow and quick, with a faint rattling sound that meant fluid in the lungs. I've heard it before, in men pulled from the water after too long under. She was drowning, or she had drowned, and somehow she was still alive enough to drown more. The tail, I'm going to call it that because I don't have another word, extended from just below her hips. The transition wasn't abrupt. It wasn't a clean line where skin stopped and scales began. It was gradual, the way a seal's body tapers. A streamlined slope that made anatomical sense if you stopped thinking in terms of human and started thinking in terms of marine mammal. But it wasn't a mammal. The tail itself was covered in something that caught the light like fish scales, but larger, more defined. They were dark, gray-green maybe, or blue-gray. The color shifted depending on the angle of the flashlight. The fluke at the end was horizontal, like a whale's, and it was scraped raw in places where the net had cut through. She was bleeding. Not much, but enough that I could see it mixing with the seawater pooled around her. The blood was red. That detail stuck with me. I don't know what I thought it would be, but it was red, normal, human red. I crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, just under her jaw, the way I'd been taught in a first aid course I took 30 years ago and barely remembered. There was a pulse, faint and too fast, fluttering like a bird's. I had no idea what to do. If she'd been human, fully human, I would have called 911, started CPR if she stopped breathing, done everything I'd been trained to do. But she wasn't human, and I couldn't call anyone, because the moment I did, this became something else. It became a spectacle, a media event, a thing that would be studied, photographed, taken away, and I looked at her, lying there in the freezing water, her chest barely moving, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I called for help, she would die. Not from her injuries, from what would happen after. So I made a decision that I've questioned every day since. I decided to move her deeper into the grotto, where the tide pools stayed full, even at low water, and I decided to see if I could keep her alive long enough to figure out what she needed. Lifting her was harder than I expected. She wasn't small, maybe 5.5 feet from head to tail, and the weight distribution was strange. The tail was dense, heavy with muscle. I got my arms under her shoulders and dragged her backward slowly, trying not to scrape her against the rocks. She didn't wake, didn't respond. There was a depression in the stone floor near the back of the grotto, a natural basin that held water year-round. It was deeper than the surrounding pools, maybe 4 feet at the center, and it was fed by a crack in the rock that let seawater seep in with every tide. I'd seen seals rest there before. It was as close to a safe place as I could offer. I lowered her into it as carefully as I could. The water came up to the middle of her torso when she settled, and I adjusted her position so her head stayed above the surface. Her hair fanned out around her, dark against the water. I sat back and tried to think. She needed salt water. That much seemed obvious. Her breathing had steadied slightly once she was submerged again, though it was still labored. But she also needed air. She had lungs. She was breathing air right now, or trying to. I didn't know if she had gills somewhere I hadn't seen. I didn't know if she could survive in full salt water, or if she needed to surface. I didn't know what she ate, or if she was warm-blooded, or if she could tolerate the cold, or how badly she was hurt. I didn't know anything. I checked my watch. The tide would turn in 90 minutes. The grotto would start filling. If I left her here, she'd either be fine or she'd drown when the water rose over her head. I couldn't leave her. I spent the next hour reinforcing the tidal pool. I hauled rocks from the beach and built up the edges, creating a low barrier that would keep the worst of the surge from washing her out, while still allowing water to flow in and keep the pool oxygenated. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't hold against a storm, but it might hold against a normal tide. She didn't wake the entire time I worked. When the water started rising, I finally made myself leave. I climbed back out of the grotto, boots soaked through, hands numb from the cold, and stood on the rocks outside, staring at the entrance as the ocean began to reclaim it. I had no idea if she'd still be there when I came back. I walked home. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I walked because my legs were shaking and my mind was blank, and I needed the time to arrive at some kind of understanding about what I'd just done. I'd found something impossible. I'd hidden it. I'd committed to keeping it secret. And I'd done it all in less than 2 hours. When I reached the house, I went inside, peeled off my wet clothes, and sat at the kitchen table in my undershirt and shorts, staring at nothing. Marianne used to say I was too calm in a crisis. "You'll process it later," she'd tell me. "Right now, you're just moving." She was right. I'd survived engine fires, capsized boats, and a deckhand's heart attack 30 miles offshore by not processing, by just moving through the problem until it was solved or I was dead. This was the same. I was moving. I'd process later. I made coffee. I drank it. I made a list. She needed food. She needed clean water flow. She needed to not be discovered. She needed medical attention I couldn't provide. She needed to heal, and I needed to figure out if she could heal, and if she did, what happened next. The tide would be low again in 12 hours. I'd go back then. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window that looks out over the water and watched the light change. And I thought about what I'd seen. Her face, human. Her blood, human. Her body, not. At dawn, I pulled my boots back on and walked north along the rocks. The grotto was still there. The ocean hadn't swallowed it. The rocks I'd stacked were still in place, though the tide had shifted a few of them. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the tidal pool. She was still there, and her eyes were open. I'm 73 years old, and I spent the first 12 months after finding her convinced I was losing my mind. That's what isolation does. It gives you too much time to doubt yourself, to replay what you saw, to construct rational explanations that don't quite fit. I'd seen her tangled in that netting, watched her chest rise and fall, met her eyes. But back in my cabin, with the wind howling and the fire crackling, it was easier to believe I'd misidentified a seal, a dolphin caught in a bad angle of light, something explainable. Then I'd return to the grotto at low tide, and she'd still be there. The first month was purely survival, hers and mine. I had no framework for what I was doing. Marine biology textbooks don't include chapters on the care and feeding of impossible creatures. I started with what I knew. She was mammalian, she breathed air, she was injured, and terrified. The netting had cut deep into her shoulder and tail. I'm not a doctor. I'm a man who once stitched his own hand after a gaff hook went through it, using vodka as anesthetic and fishing line as suture. I applied that same crude logic to her wounds. I brought clean water, iodine, bandages meant for humans. She flinched when I approached, but didn't flee. Maybe she was too weak. Maybe she understood I was trying to help. I still don't know which. Food became the immediate crisis. She needed to eat, and I had no idea what. I tried raw fish. First, mackerel, cod, whatever I'd caught that day. She ate them mechanically, the way someone eats hospital food, sustenance without enthusiasm. I expanded. Squid, mussels, still in their shells. Sea urchins cracked open. The urchins got a reaction. She consumed them with what I can only describe as focused attention, scraping the orange roe with a precision that suggested familiarity. I brought her 23 urchins the next day. She ate 17. Those early visits followed a rigid pattern. I'd wait for the tide chart, climb down the cliff path during the 2-hour window when the cave entrance was accessible, leave food on the rocks near where she rested. I never stayed long. I was afraid of crowding her, of becoming a threat rather than a resource. She watched me the entire time, those dark eyes tracking my movements with an intelligence that made my skin prickle. I didn't try to touch her again after that first day. The wounds I'd bandaged were healing on their own faster than seemed possible. Within 2 weeks, the deep lacerations had closed to pink scars. Within a month, even the scars were fading. The cave became my second home. I learned its moods, which storms made it dangerous, which tides brought in fresh seawater, where the light hit at different times of day. I reinforced the entrance with driftwood positioned to look natural, discouraging casual exploration by hikers or kayakers. I scattered rocks to make the approach treacherous. I wanted that place forgotten by everyone but me. She had a corner she preferred, where a shelf of rock created a shallow pool deep enough for her to submerge, but sheltered from the worst of the tidal surge. She'd drape herself half in and half out of the water, her tail curled beneath her, watching the cave entrance. Waiting for me or watching for threats, I couldn't tell. 3 months in, she made her first sound in my presence. I'd brought mackerel and was laying them out on our usual rock when I heard it. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the cave's stone walls. Not words, not exactly music, somewhere between a whale's song and the sustained note of a cello. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I froze. She was looking directly at me. I hummed back. I don't know why. It seemed insane even as I did it. But she tilted her head, and for the first time since I'd found her, she moved toward me instead of away. Not close, just a few feet nearer, her body sliding across the wet rock with that impossible grace. The hum came again, shorter this time. A question, maybe, an experiment. I hummed a response. We stayed like that for 20 minutes, trading sounds like children learning to speak, until the tide began to turn, and I had to leave. The 4th month brought the first real winter storm. 60-mile-per-hour winds, waves that punched 40 feet up the cliff face, rain that fell sideways. I couldn't reach the cave for 5 days. I spent those days pacing my cabin, staring at the ocean, imagining her trapped in that grotto as seawater churned and battered the rocks. When the storm finally broke, I went down in the dark, couldn't wait for dawn. I brought a lantern and climbed that cliff path in conditions that should have killed me. My hands were bleeding by the time I reached the cave entrance. She was fine, better than fine. The storm seemed to have energized her. She was moving through the water with a strength I hadn't seen before, her tail propelling her in tight circles, her body arcing above the surface. Playing, I realized. She was playing. She saw me and stopped, made that humming sound. This time it felt like greeting. I started talking to her after that. Not because I thought she understood English, but because the silence was crushing me. I'd narrate what I was doing, describe the weather, tell her about the birds I'd seen on the cliff. She'd watch me with those unsettling eyes, occasionally making sounds in response, hums, clicks, once a sharp whistle that startled us both. Month 7. She took food directly from my hand for the first time. I'd been leaving it on the rock, same as always, but this time she reached out and plucked a squid from my palm with fingers that were webbed but distinctly fingers. Her skin was cool and smooth like a dolphin's, but the structure beneath was bone and tendon and intentional movement. I should have been terrified. I wasn't. I was relieved. The distance between us had been necessary, but it was exhausting. Month 9. I realized she was healing me as much as I was helping her. The isolation I'd chosen, the deliberate solitude, had been turning toxic without my noticing. I'd stopped talking, stopped shaving, stopped maintaining routines beyond basic survival. She gave me structure, purpose. I had to check the tides, bring food, make the climb. I had to keep living because she needed me to. Month 11. She placed an object in my hand, a piece of sea glass, green and worn, smooth, about the size of a quarter. She'd found it somewhere in the cave or the tidal pools and decided I should have it. I still carry it. When people ask what it is, I tell them it's a good luck charm. By the end of that first year, I'd stopped trying to rationalize her existence. She was real. She was in my care. I'd become the keeper of a secret that would sound like madness to anyone I told, so I told no one. I just kept bringing her food, kept climbing down to that cave, kept humming when she hummed. I had no idea I'd be doing it for 19 more years. If you spend enough time observing anything, patterns emerge. This is true of tide schedules, fish migrations, storm systems. It became true of her. I started keeping records in the second year, not formal scientific logs. I'm not a researcher, but notes scribbled in a waterproof notebook I kept in the cave. Dates, behaviors, anything that repeated or seemed significant. I didn't plan to document her like a specimen. But 20 years is a long time, and memory distorts. I wanted something concrete. The first pattern I noticed was seasonal. Her activity levels shifted with the calendar in ways that tracked marine life cycles, but didn't match any single species. Spring brought restlessness. March through May, she'd spend hours circling the cave's interior, diving repeatedly into the deeper channels that connected to the open ocean. She'd disappear for stretches, 10 minutes, 30, once nearly 2 hours, and return agitated. I started bringing extra food during those months. She'd eat twice her normal intake, storing energy for something I couldn't see. I compared this to seal behavior. Harbor seals give birth in spring, and females increase food consumption dramatically beforehand. But she showed no signs of pregnancy, no physical changes that suggested reproduction. The restlessness seemed more like migratory urge, something in her biology responding to lengthening days and warming water, telling her to move, to go somewhere she couldn't reach. Summer was her most active season. June through August, she was stronger, faster, more vocal. The cave would fill with those low, resonant hums, sometimes for an hour at a time. I recorded one session on a handheld tape recorder in year 6. When I played it back later, the complexity stunned me. There were layers to it, rhythmic pulses underneath sustained tones, variations that repeated with slight modifications. Structure, syntax, almost. I sent that recording to a marine bioacoustics lab anonymously with a fabricated story about capturing unusual whale vocalizations off the coast. They sent back analysis confirming the sounds were biological, likely mammalian, but unmatched to any known species in their database. They asked for the location. I never responded. Fall brought stillness. September through November, her metabolism seemed to slow. She'd spend days barely moving, draped across her preferred rock shelf, eyes half closed. I reduced food portions, and she didn't protest. This paralleled hibernation patterns in terrestrial mammals, except she remained conscious, aware. She'd still respond to my presence, still make eye contact, but with the languid indifference of someone conserving energy. Winter was her deepest season, and I mean that literally. December through February, she spent more time in the submerged portions of the cave than on the surface. I'd arrive to find the grotto apparently empty, then catch movement in the dark water 10 feet down. She could hold her breath for at least 40 minutes. I timed it once, terrified, watching the water, until she finally surfaced. Cetaceans, whales, and dolphins can manage similar feats. Sperm whales dive for 90 minutes, slowing their heart rate to conserve oxygen. Her physiology seemed to allow something comparable, though I never understood the mechanism. She had lungs. I'd seen her breathe. But she also had something else, some adaptation that let her exist in both worlds more completely than seals or otters ever could. The vocalizations changed with the seasons too. Spring sounds were sharp, almost frustrated. Summer brought those long, layered songs. Fall was quiet. Winter produced something I can only describe as mournful, low, descending tones that resonated through the cave, like the groan of shifting ice. I started recognizing individual calls. There was one sound, a rising whistle followed by 2 short clicks that she made specifically when I arrived. A greeting, I decided, Another sound, a harsh exhalation through what must have been a blowhole or nasal cavity, meant annoyance. I got that one when I was late, or brought fish she didn't like. Year 4, I began testing her problem-solving abilities. I'd place food inside a latched wooden box, the kind used for storing fishing gear. She studied it for maybe 30 seconds, then flipped the latch with her fingers and opened it. I tried a I combination lock next. That one stumped her, but only for 2 days. I watched her manipulate the dial, listening to the clicks of the mechanism until something aligned and it opened. Octopi can do this. They can solve puzzles, open jars, navigate mazes. But octopi are invertebrates with distributed intelligence, 9 brains working in concert. She had a vertebrate structure, a centralized nervous system, and she was solving problems that required memory, abstraction, and tool comprehension. I brought her a mirror in year 7. She reacted the way dolphins and great apes do, immediate self-recognition. She studied her reflection, touched her face, examined her teeth. Then she angled the mirror to look at parts of her body she couldn't normally see: her back, her tail, self-awareness, theory of mind, markers of consciousness that separate a handful of species from the rest of the animal kingdom. The moon phases mattered. I didn't notice this until year 5, when I cross-referenced my notes with a lunar calendar. Her vocalizations intensified during the full moon, and she'd surface more frequently during high tides that corresponded with new moons. I don't know if this was biological, tidal rhythms affecting her behavior, or something else. Whales coordinate migrations with lunar cycles. So do sea turtles. She might have been responding to the same ancient cues. Year 9 brought the only time I saw her sick. She was lethargic, refused food, had mucus discharge from her nose. I panicked. I had no veterinary training, no way to diagnose or treat her. I brought antibiotics meant for fish, vitamin supplements, anything I could think of. She recovered in 6 days. Whether my interventions helped or her immune system handled it alone, I'll never know. I documented her physical changes over time, though they were subtle. She grew, but slowly, maybe 3 inches over 20 years. Scars faded and reappeared, suggesting encounters with something in the deeper water beyond the cave. Once, in year 12, she returned from one of her long submersions with a fresh bite mark on her shoulder. Semicircular, deep punctures. Shark, probably. It healed within a month. Her eyes never changed. That's what I remember most when I catalog her features in my mind. Everything else shifted slightly with seasons, age, health, but her eyes stayed constant, dark, reflective, watching me with an attention that made me feel seen in a way human eyes rarely managed. By year 15, I'd accumulated enough observations to know I was caring for something that defied classification. She had the intelligence of a cetacean, the adaptability of a pinniped, the vocalization complexity of songbirds, and the self-awareness of great apes. She was all of it, and none of it. I stopped trying to categorize her. She was herself. That was enough. The patterns I documented weren't about understanding what she was. They were about learning who she was. The specific individual in that specific cave who liked urchins more than cod, who got irritable in spring, who greeted me with a whistle and 2 clicks every time I climbed down those rocks. For 20 years, I knew her routines better than I knew my own. And then she broke the only pattern that had ever been absolute. She stopped being there. I need to tell you what 20 years looks like when it passes in silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, so consistent, so reliable, that it becomes its own form of language. Silas never spoke to her, not in the way you'd speak to a pet or even another human. He told me he tried in the beginning. The first few months he'd narrate what he was doing as he worked, describing the fish he brought, explaining why he had to check the nets, apologizing when he startled her. The sound of his voice would echo off the grotto walls, and she'd sink lower in the water, her luminous eyes watching him with what he could only describe as wariness. So he stopped. He let the silence settle between them like sediment, and in that quiet, something else emerged. By the third year, she would surface when she heard his footsteps on the rocks above. Not immediately. She wasn't a dog greeting its owner, but within minutes of his arrival, her head would break the waterline. Watching, waiting. By the fifth year, she had claimed a specific ledge near the eastern wall of the grotto, a shelf of stone worn smooth by centuries of tide. She would rest there during his visits, half in and half out of the water, her tail, he always called it a tail, never knew what else to name it, draped into the deeper pool below. From that position, she could watch him work. And she did watch, constantly. Silas said it wasn't the blank stare of a fish or even the curious gaze of a seal. Her eyes tracked his movements with purpose, with focus. When he cleaned the nets, her attention would shift from his hands to his face and back again. When he sat on the rocks to rest, something he did more frequently as the years accumulated, she would tilt her head in a gesture so distinctly human it made his chest tighten. He learned to read her moods through posture and breath. When she was agitated, her breathing quickened, the rises and falls of her chest visible above the waterline. The webbing between her fingers, delicate, translucent membranes that caught the light, would flex and spread. On calm days, she would float motionless for long stretches, only her eyes moving, her respiration so slow he sometimes had to watch for several seconds to confirm she was breathing at all. She had sounds, not speech, nothing that resembled human language, but vocalizations that carried meaning through repetition and context. There was a low, thrumming sound she made when he first arrived, a frequency he felt in his rib cage before he heard it with his ears. He came to understand it as acknowledgement, recognition. There was a sharp, clicking pattern, rapid bursts that reminded him of dolphin echolocation that she used when the tide was changing or when something in the water disturbed her. A warning, or maybe just a commentary on her environment. And there was a sound he only heard a handful of times across 2 decades, a rising, falling melody that started deep and climbed higher, eerily similar to whale song, but more complex, more structured. He heard it first during a full moon in the 8th year. He heard it again during a severe storm in year 14. He heard it the last time 3 weeks before she disappeared. He never learned what it meant. The bond that developed wasn't based on training or conditioning. Silas never tried to teach her tricks, never rewarded behavior, never attempted to domesticate her in any conventional sense. What emerged was something more fundamental, mutual recognition. She learned his patterns as thoroughly as he learned hers. She knew the rhythm of his visits, the sound of his particular footfall, the way he moved when he was tired versus when he was anxious. On the rare occasions he brought someone else, twice in 20 years, when injuries required help carrying supplies, she vanished into the deepest part of the grotto and wouldn't surface until the stranger left. She trusted him. Only him. In the 14th year, Silas fell on the rocks. A moment of lost footing on slick stone, and he went down hard, his head striking the edge of the tidal shelf. He remembered the impact, the immediate disorientation, the warmth of blood on his scalp. He remembered looking up through blurred vision and seeing her launch herself from her resting ledge into the water. What happened next, he told me, still didn't make sense to him. She surfaced directly beside where he'd fallen, so close he could feel the coolness radiating from her skin. Her hand, and it was a hand, fingers and palm and thumb, webbed but unmistakably structured like his own, reached out and grasped his wrist, not pulling, not dragging, holding. He said her grip was firm but careful, her skin against his cooler than the water, but not cold, textured in a way he couldn't quite describe. She held his wrist and watched his face, and he understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity that she was checking if he was conscious, if he was aware. When he managed to sit up, she released him and slipped back into deeper water. But she didn't retreat to her usual distance. She stayed close, circling slowly until he'd regained his footing and proven he could climb out of the grotto safely. She had been concerned. The realization hit him on the walk back to his cabin, and he sat down hard on the coastal path because his legs wouldn't hold him. She had been concerned for him. Over the years, he noticed other gestures that suggested not just intelligence, but empathy, theory of mind, the capacity to consider his state of being as separate from her own. On days when he arrived, tense, when storms had damaged his equipment, or when the isolation pressed too heavily on his chest, she would remain unusually still, her presence less intrusive, as if she understood he needed quiet. On days when he lingered longer than usual, sitting on the rocks and staring at nothing, she would sometimes surface closer than normal, watching him with an intensity that felt almost like inquiry. He began leaving small objects for her in the 10th year, not gifts exactly, but offerings. Smooth stones he found on the beach, pieces of driftwood worn into strange shapes by the sea, once a fragment of colored glass polished by sand and salt. He'd place them on her ledge and leave. The next day, they'd be gone. Not washed away by the tide, the ledge was above the waterline at all, but the highest tides, but deliberately moved. Sometimes he'd find them arranged in the shallow water at the grotto's edge. Sometimes they'd be placed on different rocks, as if she'd examined them and chosen new locations. She was responding, playing maybe, or communicating in the only way available to them. In the 18th year, she left something for him. He found it on the ledge where he usually sat, a piece of pale, curved bone, about the length of his hand, worn smooth by water and time. He couldn't identify the species it came from, too large for a fish, wrong shape for a seal, too delicate for whale. It had 3 small holes near one end, and when he held it up to the light, he saw they were too precise, too deliberately placed to be natural decay. She had made those holes, he was certain of it. He kept that bone for the rest of his life. What Silas described to me wasn't ownership or domestication. It wasn't even a relationship that fit any conventional framework we use to understand human-animal interaction. It was recognition between 2 intelligent beings who happened to exist in the same space for a span of time that became 2 decades. She never performed for him. She never obeyed him. She simply existed alongside him. And over time, that coexistence developed its own grammar, its own vocabulary of gesture and sound and shared routine. He told me once, late in our conversations, that he came to believe she stayed in that grotto not because she was trapped or dependent on his care, but because she had chosen to. The entrance was wide enough for her to leave at high tide. She was healthy enough to survive in open water. She stayed because, for reasons he would never fully understand, she wanted to. And then one day, after 20 years of choosing to stay, she chose to leave. Before we return to Silas and the empty grotto, we need to pull back and ask a question that his story demands. Was he the first? The answer, if we look beyond modern skepticism into the deeper archives of human experience, is no. Mermaids are not recent inventions. They appear in our oldest stories, carved into our oldest temples, recorded in our oldest logs. They surface across cultures that had no contact with each other, described by people who never compared notes, painted and sculpted and sung about for thousands of years before the term cryptid existed. This isn't folklore that evolved from a single source and spread. This is independent emergence, the same archetype appearing separately, repeatedly, across the entire globe. The Japanese knew them as ningyo, not the beautiful, singing creatures of Western fairy tales, but something stranger, more unsettling. Fish-like beings with human faces, their flesh said to grant immortality or terrible misfortune depending on the story. Ningyo weren't metaphors. They appeared in fishing records, in temple offerings, in warnings passed from one generation of coastal communities to the next. Catch one, some villages said, and throw it back immediately. The consequence of keeping it was always grief. In Scotland and Ireland, the Selkie legends described something different, but equally specific: seals that could shed their skin and walk on land as humans, forming relationships, often romantic, often tragic, with people they encountered. These weren't abstract myths. They were explanations for real experiences, stories told to make sense of encounters that defied easy categorization. The Selkie stories follow a pattern. A human discovers the creature, a bond forms, years pass, and then the creature returns to the sea, usually leaving devastation in its wake. The human is left on shore with memories and no proof. The structure of these tales mirrors Silas's account so closely, it's difficult to dismiss as coincidence. West Africa's Mamiwata traditions describe powerful water spirits with the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a fish or serpent. But Mamiwata weren't distant myths. They were active presences in coastal spiritual practice, beings that people claim to encounter, negotiate with, sometimes even form extended relationships with. The tradition persists today, not as historical curiosity, but as living belief. In the Philippines, in the Amazon, in Polynesia, in the Mediterranean, everywhere humans live near deep water, the same figure appears. The details shift, the names change. But the core remains consistent: intelligent humanoid beings that live in water, that occasionally interact with humans, that vanish back into the depths. We can dismiss one culture's stories as superstition. We can dismiss two as coincidence. But when the same archetype appears independently in dozens of unconnected cultures across thousands of years, dismissal becomes harder. Either every coastal society in human history independently invented the exact same imaginary creature for no clear reason, or they were all describing something real. The scientific response to this pattern has been predictably materialist. These stories, anthropologists argue, emerged from misidentified seals, manatees, or dolphins seen briefly under poor conditions by superstitious observers. The human brain, prone to pareidolia, constructed human features where none existed. This explanation works for fleeting glimpses. It falls apart under sustained observation. Silas didn't see a seal's head break the surface for 3 seconds during a storm. He spent 20 years in close proximity to a creature he examined, fed, watched, learned from. He saw her hands, her fingers, her expressions. The misidentification hypothesis requires him to be either hallucinating or lying for 2 decades, which strains credibility more than the alternative. And he isn't alone in claiming prolonged contact. Archived accounts, often buried in maritime records, local histories, or the journals of naturalists who didn't know what to do with what they'd documented, describe similar encounters. A fisherman in Norway in the 1890s who reported finding an injured sea woman and caring for her through a winter before she disappeared in spring thaw. A British naval officer in 1782 whose private letters describe a marine humanoid observed repeatedly near a specific reef off the coast of Ceylon. A Japanese monk's journal from the 1600s detailing regular sightings of a Ningyo near his coastal monastery over the course of a decade. These accounts don't appear in scientific literature. They exist in margins, footnotes, the sections of archives labeled curiosities or folklore. They're dismissed not because they've been investigated and debunked, but because they describe something that isn't supposed to exist and therefore cannot be taken seriously. But the pattern persists. Across centuries, across continents, the same story: extended contact, relationship development, sudden departure. The details are too specific, too consistent to be pure invention. The Selkie legends in particular haunt the edges of Silas's account. In those stories, the Selkie always leaves. It's the defining tragedy of the tale. The human forms a bond, believes it, will last, builds a life around the presence of this impossible being. And then one day, the Selkie finds its hidden skin, or hears the call of the sea, or simply decides the time has come, and it's gone. The human is left with an empty house and memories that sound insane when spoken aloud. Silas lived a Selkie story. He just didn't know that's what it was until it ended. The question we're left with is whether these myths are evidence of real encounters, encoded in narrative form, or whether they're such powerful archetypes that people unconsciously shape their experiences to fit the pattern. Do we tell Selkie stories because Selkies exist, or do people like Silas interpret their experiences through the lens of Selkie stories because that's the only framework available? Both possibilities are unsettling. If the myths are based on real encounters, then the ocean has been hiding intelligent, non-human beings for all of recorded history, and we've chosen to call the evidence folklore rather than face the implications. If the myths are purely psychological, then the human mind is so predisposed to inventing relationships with imaginary, marine humanoids that the same delusion appears independently across all cultures, which raises equally disturbing questions about the reliability of human perception. Silas didn't know these stories when his 20 years began. He told me he'd heard of mermaids the way everyone has. Cartoons, fairy tales, theme park attractions. He didn't know about Ningyo or Selkies or Mamiwata. He discovered those connections later when he finally started searching for any explanation, any context that might help him understand what he'd experienced. What he found was that his story had been told before, many times, in many places, by people who had no reason to coordinate their accounts and every reason to stay silent. The collective memory of humanity includes mermaids, not as fantasy, but as experience, as encounters documented and passed down and shaped into myth, because myth was the only container available for something that couldn't be explained. Silas became part of that continuum, whether he wanted to or not. His story is a modern entry in an ancient catalog, another voice added to a chorus that has been singing the same song for thousands of years. And like all the voices before him, he's singing to an audience that doesn't believe the song is real. I'm 67 now, and I spent 30 years at sea before I ever saw her. 3 decades observing marine life in every condition the Pacific can throw at you. I know what belongs in these waters, and I know what doesn't. After the first few years with her, once the initial shock calcified into routine, I started asking different questions, not, is this real? I'd already answered that one every time I descended into the grotto, but how is this possible? The ocean covers 71% of Earth's surface. We've mapped every crater on the moon, sent robots to Mars, photographed distant galaxies, and yet according to NOAA, we've explored less than 20% of our own ocean floor. More than 80% remains unseen by human eyes. Those numbers used to be abstract to me, statistics in a textbook. Now they feel different. Now they feel like hiding places. The Mariana Trench descends nearly 7 miles. At that depth, the pressure would crush a human body in seconds. But life exists down there anyway. Organisms we only discovered in the last few decades, creatures that defied what we thought biology allowed. Translucent fish with organs visible through their skin. Invertebrates that survive in conditions we'd classify as incompatible with complex life. We were wrong about what was possible. We've been wrong before. There's a theory, fringe, dismissed by most, but persistent, called the aquatic ape hypothesis. It suggests that human ancestors went through an aquatic or semi-aquatic phase millions of years ago, which explains certain anomalies in our physiology. Our subcutaneous fat distribution, similar to marine mammals, rather than other primates. Our conscious breath control, unusual among land animals, but essential for diving. The diving reflex in human infants. Mainstream anthropology rejects it. The evidence is circumstantial, the logic criticized as selective. But it asks an interesting question. If one branch of hominids could adapt toward aquatic life, why only one? Why not others further along that evolutionary path before circumstances drove our ancestors back to land? I'm not claiming that's what she was. I don't know what she was. I'm saying the ocean is deep enough and old enough to hide almost anything. She had lungs. I watched her breathe air. But she also had those gill-like structures that fluttered when she was submerged, and she could stay underwater far longer than should have been survivable. Her physiology suggested something that straddled the boundary between marine and terrestrial life. Evolution doesn't care about our categories. It responds to pressure, to environment, to survival. Given enough time and the right conditions, life finds arrangements we never predicted. The giant squid was considered a myth until 2004, when we finally captured footage of one alive in its habitat. Colossal squid, even larger, remained theoretical until 2007. These weren't ancient mysteries. These were animals sharing the ocean with us, contemporary creatures that simply lived deep enough and remote enough to avoid detection. For centuries, we had their corpses washing ashore and still called them legend. What else is down there? What other intelligence moves through water we've never touched, through trenches we've never illuminated? She was intelligent. That much wasn't speculation. I watched her solve problems, recognize patterns, communicate intent. Her vocalizations had structure, repeated phrases that seemed to correlate with specific circumstances. I'm not trained in linguistics or animal cognition, but I know the difference between random noise and language. Dolphins have signature whistles, individual names they use to identify themselves and call to each other. Whales have songs that travel thousands of miles underwater, complex vocalizations that change and evolve across generations. We've only begun to decode what they're saying. Her sounds were different, more varied, more complex. I recorded some of them years ago on an old cassette recorder I kept in the shack. I've never played them for anyone. What would be the point? Without context, they're just strange noises. Haunting, yes. Beautiful even, but proof of nothing. I think about those recordings sometimes, sitting in a drawer with corroded batteries and rusted tape mechanisms. Evidence that means everything and proves nothing. The scientific method requires replication, verification, peer review. It requires a body of evidence that others can examine and test. I have none of that. I have memory and absence. 20 years of observations that exist only in my head and in notebooks I'll never show anyone. But I also have certainty, the kind that doesn't require external validation. She existed, she was real. And somewhere in those unmapped 80% of ocean, there might be others. March 14th, 2018, a Wednesday. I remember because I'd gone into town that morning for supplies, the first time in 2 weeks. The trip took 4 hours round trip, and I resented every minute away. 20 years of daily visits had made me superstitious about breaks in routine. I returned just after 3 in the afternoon. The tide was wrong for the grotto visit, still 2 hours from low enough, so I unloaded supplies and did maintenance work on the shack, replaced a section of rotten decking, checked the rain collection barrels, ordinary tasks on an ordinary day. The tide turned at 5:47 p.m. I know because I'd been watching for it, counting down the minutes like I had for 2 decades. The walk down to the grotto took 12 minutes. I'd timed it thousands of times, knew every foothold and handhold on that descent. She was there, active, healthy. She'd caught something earlier. I could see remnants of fish scales on the rocks near her usual resting place. When I approached, she made that low, thrumming sound she used as greeting, the one that always vibrated in my chest. I stayed for an hour and 20 minutes. We went through our routine. I checked the water quality by sight and smell, examined her visible skin for any signs of injury or illness, offered the supplement paste I'd been preparing for her since year 3. She took it directly from my hand now. No hesitation, no fear. 20 years of trust. She seemed calm, content, no signs of distress or agitation. Her breathing was steady, her movements fluid, everything normal. I left at 7:15 p.m., just as the tide was starting to turn back. The last thing I remember was her watching me climb back up toward the cliff path, her dark eyes tracking my movement the way they always did until I disappeared from view. That was the last time I saw her. I returned the next morning at 6:33 a.m., earlier than usual. Something had pulled me from sleep before dawn. Not premonition, just restlessness. The tide was low enough by 6:15, and I made the descent in near darkness, using the headlamp I kept for winter visits. The grotto was empty. Not empty like she'd moved to a different position. Empty like she'd never been there. The water was still, undisturbed, no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn nets or broken equipment. Her resting rocks were bare, the small cache of shells she'd been arranging for months, gone. I called out. The sound echoed off stone and water, mocking. I searched every accessible section of the cave system, wading into deeper water than I'd ever risked before. The connecting tunnels only went so far before becoming impassable. I checked them all anyway, scraping my shoulders raw against barnacled rock, calling her name, even though she'd never had a name I could speak. Nothing. I climbed back up to the cliff and scanned the ocean for hours. No disturbance on the surface, no circling gulls that might indicate activity below, just empty water rolling against empty rocks. She was gone. For the first 3 days, I convinced myself she'd return. Animals leave sometimes. They explore, they follow food sources, they respond to instincts humans don't understand. I kept to the schedule, descending at every low tide, waiting in the grotto for hours, watching the tunnel openings for movement that never came. After a week, I expanded the search. I hiked every accessible section of coastline within 5 miles, checking every cave and inlet, every tidal pool deep enough to hide something her size. I found nothing. No trace, no sign, no body. She had simply vanished. 20 years of daily presence, erased overnight. 7,300 days of routine, shattered. All that time, all that care, all that trust, and I didn't even get to say goodbye. I kept visiting the grotto, every day at low tide for another month, then every other day, then twice a week. The schedule disintegrated, but I couldn't stop completely. Some part of me still expected to descend those rocks and find her there, waiting. She never was. Silas spent months searching for answers that would never come. He started with the possibility he wanted most to believe, that she had healed, that after 2 decades of captivity, however gentle, her body had finally recovered enough to answer the call of deeper water. Marine mammals are known to travel vast distances when conditions change. Gray whales migrate over 10,000 miles. Humpbacks cross entire ocean basins, following routes mapped into their biology. Perhaps her kind, whatever they were, had patterns written into them the same way. Perhaps she heard something he couldn't, a frequency that reached into the grotto one night and reminded her she didn't belong there anymore. But that theory required believing she would leave without hesitation, without sign. He had seen her intelligence, he had felt her recognition, and he couldn't reconcile that with complete abandonment. The darker possibilities came next, the ones that kept him awake. Naval activity had increased along that stretch of coast in the months before her disappearance. Low-frequency active sonar, the kind used by military vessels to map the ocean floor and detect submarines, is known to disorient marine mammals, causing mass strandings and driving whales into shallow water where they beach themselves. If she had been driven from the grotto by sound, confused and panicked, she could have surfaced anywhere. She could have been seen. He thought about illegal fishing operations, the kind that use nets miles long and don't ask questions about what they haul up. He thought about deep-sea mining exploration, about corporate vessels with cameras that feed data to labs far from public scrutiny. He thought about someone else finding her. The environmental theories came last, the ones supported by data he could actually verify. Water temperatures along the coast had risen 3 degrees over 2 decades. Pollutants were increasing. Acoustic mapping showed minor seismic activity offshore. Any of those shifts could have made the grotto uninhabitable, could have triggered an instinct to flee that overrode everything else. Each theory felt simultaneously possible and insufficient. Silas is 74 now, still living in the same house above the sea. He doesn't go to the grotto anymore. What remains is a collection of memories that belong only to him. 2 decades of daily visits, of learned patterns and mutual recognition, of a relationship that existed entirely outside the boundaries of what the world considers real. He grieves for someone he can never publicly mourn. He carries knowledge he can never verify, and he lives with the specific isolation of having experienced something that left no proof behind. The psychological weight of that is difficult to overstate. He kept no scales, no physical evidence. He says he thought about it once, years in, but it felt like a violation. She wasn't a specimen. She was, he pauses when he says this, she was herself. So now he has only his account, and an account without corroboration is, in scientific terms, worthless. This is where the story lives, in that unbridgeable gap between personal testimony and verifiable fact. Confabulation is a documented phenomenon. The brain, when faced with gaps in memory or understanding, will create details to complete the narrative. Isolation can intensify emotional bonds to the point where they reshape perception. None of this is offered as explanation, but as context, as one of many frames through which this story might be understood. Silas knows what he saw, he knows what he felt, and he knows that without evidence, his truth remains his alone. The ocean holds approximately 320 million cubic miles of water. Humans have explored less than 20% of it. Entire ecosystems exist at depths we've never reached. Species are discovered yearly, not small organisms, but large animals that have lived undetected for millennia. The absence of proof is not proof of absence, but it's also not proof of presence, and that's the space where Silas now lives, where belief and doubt occupy the same breath, where wonder and grief are inseparable. I'm 74 now. The grotto is still there, unchanged except by tide and time. I walk down when my legs allow it, though I know what I'll find. Empty water, bare rock. The ocean moving through like nothing ever happened. Some nights I wonder if I imagined all of it, 20 years compressed into a dream, vivid enough to feel like memory. But then I remember details too, specific to invent, the pattern of scales along her shoulders, the way she surfaced on the third wave, always the third, the scar on her wrist from the netting that brought us together. I can't prove any of this. I know that. Maybe that's how it was meant to be, a secret that stays secret, a wonder that exists only in the space between what I know and what the world will accept. The ocean keeps what it keeps. I was just lucky enough to be trusted with part of it for a while.